Michael Rohatten, share an unusual last name. And so this, your father, Felix, is sort of one of the centers of this story. Was this part of family lore when you were growing up, or is this something you kind of learned about later?
No, I really remember so much of it, and you know, I attribute it to the fact that we didn't have cell phones. It sounds corny, but I think it's pretty true that like I just remember everything from those days, and now I don't remember anything from last week. But there was nothing else to really interact with. You just had your life. And New York was very vivid, very visceral kind of a place. Also a magical place of kind of adventure and freedom. My father was living in very funky circumstances. My parents had split up, and he was an investment banker living in one of our talking heads, the guy who mentions that the New York Times was considered the Uptown Daily Worker at his house. He referred to my father's hotel, which was a real flea bag, as a dormitory for divorced investment bankers. So he had a crummy one-bedroom there, and all of this 1975 unfolded in that universe, and he was kind of taken up by it. And yeah, I remember it vividly. It was really a novelty, and then it became kind of life, and I grew up with Victor Gottbaum and all of that happening around me.
Yeah. There's this shot of Felix ushering in two kids as one of those
little one.
Yeah. That's amazing.
He's a pretty good dad, you know, looking after us somehow. We were part of whatever we were going to dinner, and we were always in that world, and it was just really a lovely thing. And I've said this, you know, the amazing thing for me, one of the many, is that in the early interviews you can see he's kind of a novice, and he looks down, he's kind of bashful. And then within months, like weeks and months, he kind of got his footing. And he became somebody who really loved the press, loved the interacting, always had a good line, was really thought about like the metaphors that he was going to use. And it was a story that was driven by the press, by communication, and yet he completely grew into it.
Yeah. So this movie is told through archive. There's a lot of archival footage. And the archive is doing a lot of work, because one, it's moving the broader narrative forward, but also inside of each scene, you're constructing these little moments of joy and pleasure, like lowering Beame's mic down, the husband smiling, like, and even the sort of freeze frame of like, whose fault is this? Who got very, very bad advice? And it zeroes in on Shady Rumsfeld and freeze frame. Could you talk about that type of assembling that, Peter? Like, that just seems like a monumental task to me.
It was, and it's a tribute to our editors and to our archival producer, because it was really an excavation. And it should be pointed out that this 1975 was essentially the last year that the local news, or any news really, shot the news on 16mm film. And so if you went a year or two, certainly 3 or 4 later, it would be video, for better or, to my mind, largely worse from an aesthetic standpoint. So there's a real pleasure, arguably, to be had. This is a giant screen, which is really nice. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to see it on a big screen. But I think that's largely enabled like the texture of the film and all of that. So we knew that we wanted to play off the archive. And then for more important reasons, it was a way, of course, to bring the city alive. And then we first had, and we were also well aware that we were making a film about the fiscal crisis, and it's conspicuous in its absence from previous films. It really is a subject that hadn't been touched. It's of great consequence, and the downstream effects culturally and in many, many ways are obvious, and people know about the blackout in '77 or Son of Sam or all these dystopian things that happened in New York, but this is largely why. But arguably that's a pretty wonky thing to engage in cinema. And so rather fast, we didn't want to water down the substance of the crisis and of the economics and the ideologies that were at war, but to keep those ideas and those wonky things alive, we realized we have to really own the archive, and we have to really go all in on the Kesslers, the couple at the beginning. My wife has said it all. That those little moments could really elevate things and bring the city alive.
Because that's the other really difficult thing that you're doing here. I mean, this is a movie that's a thriller about municipal finance and how bonds work, which is hard. How do
Never again.
I mean, when you know that going into it, obviously, but there's a certain point where you have a certain fealty to getting the facts right, and making sure people understand them. And understanding them there's no shortcut to understanding them. You really have to go through the motions, and really explain it well. What was your approach to that?
We had a 3-hour cut, and then we had a 2.5-hour cut. And, we just kept cutting it down. We kept putting things back. My concern was that we use all the good stuff. And that was a lot of different stuff. And a lot of it was that outtake, B-roll, kind of blooper stuff. The storytelling part of it, it only really occurred to me not that long ago that our very first shot of Gregory Jackson, the reporter who blows it in the first, he flubs the opening line.
Yeah.
And in a movie, you're trying on some meta level. Your first scene is your movie, right? You want to deliver the movie in the first sequence. That's the story. It's impossible to tell this story. Like, he just did it for us. We're giving it to you now, and so here's how we resolved it. We built, a couple of things. I think we sort of punted early on, like, well, who is the hero here? Well, it's the city of New York, which is kind of bullshit. Like, yeah, that's pretty easy. And then, I think we started to see that Beame, who nobody, even the talking heads in the movie were like, why did you elevate Beame? Like, this guy was like nowhere. But he is the central hero. He's the one who has all the hope in the beginning. It's a classic story, He sets himself up. This is my big day. It totally gets pulled out from underneath him. And in the archive, he's the one who conveys. Like, Q Carey, a lot of these other people, they had a surface when they spoke. They had a certain kind of, charismatic affect. Cameras are rolling, they talk a certain way. Beame, you just saw it right away. And he was an honest and dignified person and very touching. And so I think that when we kind of figured, like, this is going to be our guy, and we can treat it a little bit as a traditional story of a person, and then build the kind of wonky stuff, and a lot of that we didn't have a narrator, so we had to use the newscast that delivered the information in a way that was kind of coherent. And I'll just say one more little thing is that the BBC, if you see stuff in there, like there's a Monty Python guy, right? Eric Idle guy. The BBC did 2 one-hour programs in 1975, like concurrent with this, that are unbelievably thorough, with all of it, with charts and the whole thing, telling the whole story. And if you didn't understand it, just rent those 2 and you'll totally get it. But basically, we kind of like structured it just using those kinds of tools to deliver this.
I mean, this is interesting now that you mentioned a non-narrated documentary where Beame is kind of your, pseudo-hero, but none of the contemporary narration has Beame as the hero at all. Like, in fact, he's the villain. How did you manage to pull that off?
A lot of love.
Well, he's sort of he's not an anti-hero, but...
Well, but like,
he relates to,
but there's a sense of him where when I watched it, and I got it the more I'd seen the movie a couple of times as we were preparing to talk about it on the show, like, that Beame kind of got a raw deal. Like, he was doing the thing he always had done. Everyone was with him. All of his compatriots were kind of running the books the same way. And all of a sudden, he's just left to deal with it.
I think some people have asked us, Trump, for example, was just emerging at the tail end of this, and did we consider putting him in, and why didn't we? We actually had a cut early on because he got his first real estate deal kind of out of the rubble of this arrangement. And we thought that could capsize things because you'd be like, oh, villain, or that would skew things. You could argue for it, but we wanted to really dial down into the story. And I think similarly, Beame, in almost his absence of ideology and frankly charisma, and to some degree accounting, acumen. But in that, he left the space to do, to my mind, not to sound pretentious, but for it to become a film about a clash of ideologies. It's not like, oh, and there's Trump, and let's point our finger at him and say it was that guy, or it was the banks. It was the banks, but you know what? Banks are greedy, and banks, a shock of shocks. They didn't have the best interest of the people at heart. Okay, moving on. How interesting and shocking is that? What to me, and I think to us, was interesting the longer we worked on it, was this was a moment where this ideological collision was playing out in the streets of New York. And it was the end, or at least perhaps not the permanent end, but an end to the Great Society vision of what a city could do or should do for its people, as it kind of shot across the bow of Reaganism, as they say in the movie, this kind of newfangled, Milton Friedman-esque. It's not that any of these ideas were new unto themselves, but they were colliding. You can see it playing out, and not soon after this, by 80 obviously, you have Reaganism essentially carrying us forward in a corporatist manner for a number of decades, and even today, and then I'll be quiet, with tomorrow actually, with the mayoral election in New York City and elsewhere, but most obvious in New York with its analog to this. A lot of the opposition to Mamdani is, well, even look back 50 years ago, we quote unquote tried this, all kinds of liberal spending, caring for people, and look what happened last time that the city went over a cliff. We can talk about, if you wish, about those kinds of things, but the effects of these ideologies are real and are still with us.
Let me just say one thing, because we've sort of had people say, well, why did you let Lindsay off the hook? And Lindsay was mayor before Beame, and is very often given the credit for the overspending. And we prefer to kind of find that without Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor, you couldn't have overspending, because actually if you went upstream, the city is a creature of the state, and the city had to go to the state to approve every borrowing. And so it was sort of more interesting in terms of the power broker thinking about that book. Where was the power? The power was Nelson Rockefeller and this genial East Coast Republican who now is like a dinosaur in the party. Arguably Beame was nothing to do with power. Of course, he was in fact robbed of his power, but kind of as just a person, because we're making a movie here and not writing, the opus. You know what I mean? So we kind of went with a little bit of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think anyone in this room is struck by how far the Overton window has moved in terms of people talking about what a city's responsibility to its citizenry is, in terms of just free tuition and these services like healthcare services and things like why people were attracted to the place, why people that they held up them being within one generation of being an immigrant, and that was the heartbeat of the city. Even today, when Mamdani mentions free buses, people are like, "What are you talking about? Like free buses? This is not a world that. This is a world within our memory." I am struck by how, when you put it up there, how much has changed through Reaganism. And I mean, you're creating a commentary by the juxtaposition of the words and images, and you know where people are presently today. I'm just like, how do you construct that so that you are presenting? You're kind of having a conversation with the audience without knowing how they're going to receive it. Are they going to recognize what you're talking about?
Right. I mean, and I think it's something we discussed / argued about for months, years, going back and forth between ourselves and with our editors, and it's quite kind of kaleidoscopic. If we went too far in one way, it would slant this way or that way. And I mean, my personal view is that it's an incredibly complicated question, and that and to slant it one way, one could make, a loaded word, but a propagandistic film. Like, we want to argue big, I have my personal political opinions about things, but there really are a multitude of factors that caused this. It was like a perfect storm of things. Yes, liberal spending, but a lot of other things, the national recession, the turn that, plummeting tax tax rates, white flight, and the cycle of X, Y, and Z. And if any of these things had been different, perhaps they could have continued on for a while. So it's too simple or simplistic to say it was just one factor, right? And we wanted to try to embody that complexity and raise these as questions in the hopes that people would find in it what they want and maybe even debate it. And I don't think there's a simple solution, even marching forward. Whatever one thinks of Mamdani one way or the other, you gotta be careful. And how do you run it? And these are complicated things, but what's inspiring, I think, to us about it is that different parties ultimately came together and wrestled with hard problems. And they didn't solve it perfectly, and it's still flawed, and you could critique it from either side or all sides. But they did the work, and there was a belief, and I think it's very moving to me about Michael's father. He was a very successful banker, among other things. He believed in the power of government, and he didn't just try to dismantle it. And there's a nihilism now where if things are hard and it's not working, let's blow it up. And that to me this is a different kind of lesson.
Yeah, it's a shame that, I mean, that's putting it mildly. This story is really used as, evidence of the folly of a certain kind of liberalism. And if you let the unions have whatever they want, this is where you go, right? It's so much more complicated than that. Arguably, the unions do what you're supposed to do. You argue, you get your best contract. You compete with collective bargaining, and you make your best deal. Who didn't play the game the way you're supposed to? No one in government did. There was nobody on the other side who was working their side with the same level of professionalism and purpose, And but it inevitably, even now, people who kind of even know a lot about it say, well, the unions were getting paid too much. The unions, we were not, the city of New York didn't have the highest paid unions in New York relative to the cost of living. But we did have the most profitable banking system, and they were just pulling in money. And if you follow all of the other players that are required for this to work correctly, and how many of them failed, accounting, risk management from the banks, really the press did what you're supposed to do, and the unions did what you're supposed to do. And in a way, luckily, the unions were so well paid that they actually had money in the bank to then lend back to sort of save the day.
Yeah. I'm struck by, it's really fun and funny to watch everyone talk, especially when they're coming to the negotiation table and there's lots of big talk, like I'm gonna punch him in the face and he's wearing his gun and stuff like that. But there's a sense that even there is that rhetoric, that there is a shared common humanity, that they're all there, and they all kind of trust each other at their core, even though they have different interests.
We had Herb Ellish, who's one of our guys, who says, well, why are you coming back to the city of New York? That's what they said about the dinosaurs. He did a panel with us the other day and reminded us, and I won't tell the whole story because it's long, and we didn't put it in the film because it's long, but there was even a worry within the ranks that their leadership was getting too close to the other negotiators, right? So Victor Gottbaum had to worry that his own membership was becoming suspicious of him for spending too much time behind closed doors with these people. And what are these deals that are happening? Because they were all going to involve layoffs, right? And they had to stage like a fight where Victor went to Herb and said, use the word, next time we go in front of these microphones, use the word frivolous. and Herb said, I don't use the word frivolous. It's not, what are you doing? He said, just use it. And Herb said, well, I think some of these demands are frivolous. And then Victor stepped in front of the mic and tore him a new one. They just went nuts, and then they went off and said, I thought that went pretty well.
I love it. So, the story of this and how it plays out in the national and the international stage is very resonant today. Like right now, cities, our city, is used as this political football to do all kinds of nefarious things, and it often, if there is an opportunity for an Alabama senator to wag its finger at the city, they will take that opportunity. When you think about this story and you think about how do you think it resonates with today in terms of like where it's even just like the imagination of the city in other states more than the city itself. You know, you're both in New York now, presently. And you know, how does that strike you when you see people talk about us in different ways? And it's very similar to this.
I think it's really one-to-one. It's very similar. Some of the quotes, as you say, from the Southern senators and others could be from yesterday or from today. I mean, I think a big, so the political calculus is probably similar, looking at these urban areas, including, of course, San Francisco, as like, you know, mosaics of sin, probably, or, you know, but diversity and sexual diversity and, you know, all cultural diversity and disproportionately immigrant and even of color, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all things that currently, and back then, overtly or less so, had political resonance or were believed to have political resonance. So that's true. I mean, I think one difference, even looking at the past year today, up till today, was back then there was genuinely a real crisis. I mean, this was a real fiscal crisis, and it did need the government's involvement, ultimately. What we're seeing happening right now is essentially a manufactured crisis by the federal government, in my opinion, and therefore will send in the guard. You know, they're trying to use cities that same way. I mean, but crime rates have never been lower in New York City than they are today, ever, since the time they were measured, and yet he's threatening to send in the guards to bring order. Same with Chicago. Not ever, but I think it's been many decades since they had murder and violent crime as low as it is, and yet you move in. So if you don't, this was a real crisis provoking, you know, this tension. Today, if you don't have that real crisis, you still want to go after cities, so you'll generate an artificial one to the same effect.
Yeah, I mean, it's the flyover states. And when Nelson, you know, in this next cycle, Ford ran for president again, and they, Rumsfeld and Cheney hated Rockefeller, as we mentioned. They pushed him off the ticket, and they got Bob Dole to be the vice president. And the Republican convention in 1976 was in Kansas. So the pivot to the flyover state, you know, audience, public base, and then the sort of demonizing of the urban, you know, that had already been part of a GOP playbook in the Nixon years, even earlier. I just want to say one thing, which is, you know, now New York's an international city. Rich people in New York are global, banks are global, the press is global. Like, I don't know what happened to New York. But places like this, what you can learn from this movie is that when New York was left to itself, which we were, like it was basically abandoned. Everybody had left, you know, willingly or forced out. The identity and the purpose, the power that came from that, that kind of predicament of being, you're just stuck, can produce amazing things. And maybe that's what we can learn today in a place like this, or places where, you know, the problems seem intractable, and the distraction is, we need to get more help, or this fucking guy is, you know, is sending troops, and he's using us, and we're you know, we're all a little bit blinded by it, but you can build your own story, and I think, you know, maybe that can happen in, you know, all of these beautiful urban places that we have.
Yeah. Amen. So the title of your film, and one of the sort of pivot points of this is "Forward to City Drop Dead." This headline. You know, this is a headline that is remembered. There was a New York Times article about the headline writer, like this week. That's a pretty rare occurrence, and it's one of those things that when you think about, you know, how the news media is often on its back heels today, how important that, well, maybe you should tell me, how important do you think that headline was to changing the narrative of this story?
Just game changer. And I think they knew it. I don't think Ford knew it, because they didn't write it. But I think the guys in the newsroom were like, that works. And I know that my father, when he saw it, he said, this is going to be good for us. And I think, so yeah, it was a total game changer. As Peter has pointed out, it's like maybe it goes down in the annals of PR as the worst possible advice ever to have given your client, which is, you know, Dick Cheney saying, I think we ought to be tough. But it was a total game changer. The Daily News was read by everybody in New York. And this is what I think, like I said, I was talking about earlier. The press was a local press. They did an incredible job of conveying the nuances of this story. You knew, everybody on the street knew who the head of the Teamsters Union was. Actually, the Teamsters didn't figure that much in it, but they did know that Al Shanker, who eventually became a punchline in a Woody Allen movie, you know, like these are people that no one in New York knows the name of the head of the teachers union. You know? And that was because the press was part of it, and it is one of those unique stories where the press became part of the story. They actually altered the narrative rather than just sort of neutrally kind of reporting.
The ultimate solution to the first sort of crisis of the teachers union using their, or the different unions using their pensions to buy in bonds. It's a really clever solution to the problem. Who came up with that? Like, and was there a worry that they were just kind of creating this weird fiscal solution that had no foundation, that they were just passing money around?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that would be on my dad
Yeah.
and others. And it was incredibly risky. I actually don't even think we convey it quite to the right. I love the shot of Shanker when he comes out, totally defeated, and like we didn't want the city to go down, and no one else was stepping up, so we had to do it. And you can see what it's done to this guy, charismatic, drowsy, fascinating character. But you know, he had to convince the trustees of the union to buy these bonds, and these bonds were totally, you know, a novelty.
Yeah.
And it really was one of those things that if anyone blinked, there was like suddenly a shudder where Albany suddenly balked at raising taxes, or any piece of this was like came loose. Those bonds were not going to be a healthy thing for the pension funds. So it was an incredibly sort of brave and desperate. The alternative was arguably as bad, which was the end of collective bargaining. That their contracts would be worthless if the city went bankrupt. And then, you know, and I guess we did try to point out that there was no such thing as bankruptcy law about a municipality as big as New York. You know, right now, this year, the city's operating budget is $116 billion. Like the idea of giving that to a bankruptcy judge to kind of like, you figure out like who gets what. And that was kind of the alternative.
There were some of the people we spoke to, we didn't put this in, but we said, well, hypothetically, you know, so what would have happened if it had gone over the cliff like that? And people, straight-facedly, I mean, the serious players in this, their memories included things like selling Central Park, you know, selling the Brooklyn Bridge. You know, you would liquidate stuff the way one liquidates the bankruptcy.
Today you have private equity, and they would have bought.
Yeah. When you say $6 billion in debt today, it seems like such a quaint number.
It is 3 times more than he thought it was. So it's still a pretty high error rate.
Okay, so this movie is 50 years old, or the movie's brand new. The story is 50 years old. You know, when you present it to people today, what do you want them to take away from it? Like, what do you want them to think about?
Whatever they will. I mean, I personally am kind of a wonky person who believes that, and it's increasingly hard to do in this country, but it's important to know our history and our mistakes and our successes, and I think they're both in this story that are really vital and pretty relevant. I mean, and I think just to know it, to see what happened, and to take those as inspiring and cautionary tales at the same time. Like, I personally would not make a flag either way and say, this is an example of the triumph of X, Y, and Z, without also on the other side of the flag having, and of ABC, and a cautionary tale about ABC. And so I think, I mean, the hope, and it feels a bit like, you know, whistling in the wind in the current state of like quick cut, you know, what's the point you want to make, and what's the ideology? But I would actually say the value to me that I want people to hold, and it almost feels radical and old-fashioned these days, is like complexity. Mm-hmm. And especially when it comes to an ideological and political issue that affects what it is to be living as a citizen in America, that it's complicated. and that we should wrestle with these things, and we're not going to get them right. And at various points, it's going to go too far, too far over there. Don't blow the whole thing up. Get in there and like wrestle to figure it out. I mean, that's, I guess, what I would hope in a pretty.
Yeah, and I guess I would say, like what you do, the way you're bringing out stories and details and complexity, I totally envy, because you're going into it and you drill down and you take your time with it. This form doesn't let you do that. What it does give you is pacing and joyful, kind of the unvarnished bits and the sort of messy part, and kind of just delivering that. And I really hope that people come away with a feeling for, there's a sort of joyfulness in all of the affairs, the complex, chaotic, traumatic affairs in our societies. And that's something probably to celebrate, and so that I feel.
Well, you both made a really joyful film about municipal bond creation.
Thank you for doing this.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you so much.
The most informed people we've ever, all those hands for the power broker. We both went and had a drink because we were like, oh wow. I want to point out that there's the 99% invisible sticker on the sofa that we included with very bad photoshopping. As a fighting the man on AI, we decided to leave the bad graphic. Anyway, thank you, Rowan.
Oh, thank you. And thanks everyone for being here. It was really fun. It was fun to premiere.